the man who attended his own funeral. A true crime twist you won't believe. The 14th of September 2019, Clearwater, Florida. The air was thick with grief as the mourners gathered inside the St. Augustine Memorial Chapel in Clearwater, Florida. The sky overhead was a dull shade of gray, the kind that threatened rain but never quite delivered. It was as if the heavens themselves were mourning the man they had all come to say goodbye to. Inside the chapel, the low murmur of hushed voices echoed against the high ceilings. Rows of wooden pews were filled with people dressed in somber black, their heads bowed, their faces etched with sorrow, disbelief, or quiet speculation. Some had known Steven Mahoney for decades, business associates, high-profile investors, men who had once shaken his hand and trusted him with millions. Others were old friends, people who had watched him rise from a struggling real estate agent to a self-made multi-millionaire. And then there were the ones who weren't there for closure, but for answers. Because Steven Mahoney wasn't just gone, he had vanished. The family left behind. In the front pew, the Mahoney family sat in devastated silence. Jennifer Mahoney, his grieving widow, clutched a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands. Her eyes, swollen and red, were fixed on the closed casket at the front of the chapel. It was polished mahogany, expensive, pristine, completely untouched. Because inside, there was a body, but it wasn't Steven. Beside her, their two teenage children, Matthew and Elise, sat in stiff silence. Matthew, 18, clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the edge of the pew. He was trying to hold it together, but every so often his gaze flickered toward his mother, as if waiting for some explanation that would never come. Elise, just 15, stared at her lap, her hands balled into fists. She had barely spoken a word since her father had been declared legally dead. For 6 months, they had hoped. Hoped for a phone call. Hoped for a sign. Hoped for anything but this. Now all they had was a funeral without a body, a casket without closure, and a mystery without an ending. The mystery of Steven Mahoney's disappearance. Steven Mahoney, a 46-year-old real estate mogul, had been missing for 6 months. His yacht, the Valencia, had been found adrift off the coast of Key West, its engine still idling, rocking gently on the waves. No sign of a struggle. No drops of blood. No forced entry. No distress calls. No Steven. His wallet, phone, and shoes had been neatly placed inside the cabin, as if he had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. For weeks, the Coast Guard searched the waters, dragging the ocean floor, sending out alerts, scanning every marina from Florida to the Bahamas. Nothing. Then came the dead-end leads. A man who looked like Steven was spotted boarding a ferry, and Cuba Butt security footage proved it wasn't him. A private investigator hired by Jennifer received an anonymous tip that Steven was alive in Argentina, but the lead went nowhere. Then, in August 2019, a body matching Steven's description washed up on the shore of Key Larga Butt DNA confirmed it wasn't him. Still, without a body, no one could say for certain if Steven was dead. But after 6 months of nothing, Jennifer had been forced to make a decision. The judge had ruled Steven Mahoney legally deceased. And now, here they were, burying a stranger, a shadow in the distance. Outside the chapel, the wind stirred the trees, sending leaves skittering across the pavement. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few luxury cars, the kind that had once belonged to Steven's wealthiest associates. And in the shadows, beyond the reach of the funeral home's dim exterior lights, a man stood watching. He was tall, dressed in dark jeans, a fitted black jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His sunglasses reflected the chapel lights, hiding his eyes. His hands remained in his pockets, his body unnervingly still, except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. He watched as Jennifer wiped her tears. He watched as the Mahoney children sat motionless, their grief paralyzing. He watched his own funeral. And then, without a word, he turned and walked away. As he moved toward the far end of the parking lot, a black sedan idled nearby. Its engine was running. The tinted window rolled down slightly, just enough for the driver to see him approach. The man in the baseball cap paused for a moment. Then he got into the car. The window rolled back up, and as the funeral continued inside, the car disappeared into the night. What the hell was going on? Had Jennifer Mahoney just buried the wrong man? Was Steven Mahoney alive? And if so, had he come, and why had he left? One thing was certain, this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. 3 days later, a midnight sighting. The Florida night air was thick with humidity as the clock inside the 24-hour Sunoco gas station blinked 12:37 a.m. in dull green digital numbers. The place was dead quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional shuffle of a car pulling up to the pumps, and the steady, rhythmic tapping of Mike Landry's fingers against the counter as he scrolled through his phone. It was another slow night, the kind where the only customers were truckers looking for coffee, drunks stumbling in for chips, or the occasional night owl with insomnia. Then, the bell above the door jingled. Mike barely looked up. Then he saw who had just walked in. A dead man walks into a gas station. At first, Mike thought his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him. The man who entered was tall, wearing a charcoal gray suit, slightly wrinkled, like he had been wearing it for days. His hair was disheveled, his beard slightly unkempt, as if he had been sleeping in his car. But it wasn't his clothing or his tired posture that made Mike's breath catch in his throat. It was his face, because he had seen that face before, not in person, but in a framed photograph at a funeral surrounded by weeping mourners. It was Steven Mahoney. Mike's fingers tightened around his phone. He felt cold all over, though he wasn't sure why. For a moment, he wanted to tell himself it was just a guy who looked like Steven. But deep down, he already knew the truth. The transaction that changed everything. Steven walked to the back of the store, moving slowly, deliberately, as if he wasn't in a hurry, like a man who had nothing to fear. He grabbed a bottle of water and walked back toward the counter. Mike forced himself to breathe. He rang up the sale, his hands trembling slightly as he hit the buttons. The total popped up on the screen, $2.49. Then, in a voice that came out dry and uneven, he said, "Hey man, you look kind of familiar." Steven didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an embarrassed smile. A calm, knowing smile, the kind of smile that said, "I know what you're thinking, and I know you're too afraid to say it." Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a $5 bill, and slid it across the counter. Mike swallowed hard. He wanted to say nothing. He wanted to pretend this wasn't happening, but the words escaped before he could stop them. You're Steven Mahoney, right?" And for the first time, the smile disappeared. Steven's expression darkened, just for a second. Something in his eyes shifted, like a shadow passing over them. Then, without a word, he picked up his bottle of water, turned, and walked out the door. Mike stood frozen, heart hammering in his chest. Through the window, he watched as Steven climbed into a black rental car. Something was off about the vehicle. It had no license plate. The engine purred softly, and then he was gone. Security footage doesn't lie. By the next morning, Mike Landry had called the police. By sunrise, the gas station security footage had gone viral. News outlets exploded with headlines. A missing Florida millionaire declared dead, spotted alive at gas station. Who was buried in Steven Mahoney's grave? Is this the ultimate fake death crime? Detectives rushed to investigate. The security footage was crystal clear. This wasn't a mistaken identity case. This wasn't a look-alike. It was Steven Mahoney, and if Steven was alive, then who was buried 3 days ago? The Mahoney family was forced to relive their nightmare when authorities ordered an emergency exhumation of the body buried under Steven's name. Forensic teams worked through the night, carefully unsealing the mahogany coffin that had been lowered into the ground only days before. And when they opened it, the entire investigation took a disturbing turn. The exhumation, who's in the grave? Inside the sealed coffin, wrapped in a tailored Armani suit, was a decomposing body. At first glance, he could have passed for Steven Mahoney. Same height, same build, same dark hair. But there was one problem. It wasn't Steven. A stranger in Steven's clothes. The forensic pathologist worked methodically, scanning for identifying marks, examining dental records, and running DNA tests. The results? A horrifying dead end. The body's DNA didn't match any known person. His fingerprints weren't in any criminal database. No missing persons report matched his description. His dental records had been altered as if someone had intentionally filed down his teeth to prevent identification. He was a ghost, a man who had never existed. And yet, he had been buried under Steven Mahoney's name, dressed in Steven's clothes, wearing Steven's watch, lying in a coffin meant for Steven. So who the hell was he? And more importantly, who put him there? A sinister message. Just when detectives thought it couldn't get any stranger, they found something. Tucked into the dead man's suit pocket was a note, handwritten on yellowed paper. It contained only 4 words: "Let the dead stay dead." So, where was Steven Mahoney? The question haunted investigators. Theories began to spiral out of control. Had Steven staged the entire thing? Had someone framed him? Or was he running from something bigger? Theory number 1, Steven Mahoney faked his own death. He staged his disappearance, planted a John Doe body to throw off authorities, and planned to start a new life. The $3.2 million withdrawal before his disappearance was his escape fund. The letters with $100 bills sent to his wife were his way of leaving Breadcrumb's own sick inside joke. But something went wrong. Perhaps the wrong body was found. Perhaps someone caught onto his plan. Perhaps he had to resurface before he was ready. Theory number 2, Steven Mahoney was running from something bigger. Maybe he owed the wrong people money. Maybe his business dealings weren't as clean as they seemed. Maybe the body in the grave was a warning. The note found inside the John Doe's suit pocket: "Let the dead stay dead." Was that meant for Steven? Had he escaped before they could bury him for real? And if so, why did he come back? The case remains open. Because one thing was certain, Steven Mahoney was never supposed to walk away. But somehow, he did. And now, someone, somewhere, is still looking for him. So, where the hell was Steven? Authorities searched the Mahoney estate, looking for anything that could explain Steven's 6-month disappearance. That's when they found something. Inside Steven's private study, hidden in a safe, was a single envelope. Inside the envelope was a $100 bill and a note. Scrawled in Steven's own handwriting were the words, "I'm sorry, Jen. It had to be this way." That was it. No explanation. No details. Nothing. Was Steven running? Or was he hiding? Investigators pieced together a timeline. Steven had vanished from his yacht. A dead man in his clothes had been buried in his place. Then Steven showed up at a gas station, alive. But why? And more importantly, who was the dead man? Theory number 1, Steven Mahoney faked his own death. He staged his disappearance, planted a John Doe body to throw off authorities, and planned to start a new life. But something went wrong, and he had to resurface. Theory number 2, Steven Mahoney was running from something bigger. Maybe he owed the wrong people money. Maybe his business dealings weren't as clean as people thought. Maybe the body in the grave was a warning. The final sighting, and then he was gone. A week after the gas station sighting, Steven Mahoney was spotted again. This time it was at Miami International Airport. A man matching his description, wearing a black cap and sunglasses, was seen boarding a flight to Buenos Aires, Argentina. But when authorities checked the passenger manifest, there was no Steven Mahoney, no alias matching his ID, no way to trace him. And just like that, Steven Mahoney was gone. The case remains open. To this day, Steven Mahoney has never been found. His family never saw another trace of him. The body in the grave was never identified. And every year, on the 14th of September, the anniversary of his funeral, his wife, Jennifer, receives a single envelope. Inside, a $100 bill, and nothing else. Final thought, could Steven Mahoney still be alive? If he faked his death, where is he now? If he was running from someone, did they finally catch him? And most chilling of all, who was the man they buried in his place? Because someone knew, and they made sure Steven was watching, even if it was from the shadows of his own funeral. The case remains open, and the world is still waiting for Steven Mahoney's next move.